Hi guys, so based on feedback from the last set of tutorials on bulletproofing forms in Excel, a lot of you want to see how to get data from this form and put it into a kind of database, like another worksheet within the workbook, so that this form is actually usable and it's going to save the data. So I decided for the next few tutorials, what I'm going to do is show you how to get the data from here into another worksheet to store it. I'm going to show you also how to retrieve that data and display it in this user form, how to update the data in this new data tab that we're going to create, and also how to delete or remove it. And we're going to do all of this using this form here. We're going to expand it a little bit, make it a little better. In addition, I decided I'm going to start doing premium courses or premium tutorials on teachexcel.com. And my current thought with that is that I'll take some of these tutorials from YouTube, such as this Bulletproof Forms in Excel series that we're working on, put those in a premium course, but then add a bunch of tutorials under each one of these tutorials that can explain topics or things you might want to do that don't necessarily work well as individual tutorials here on YouTube. So that's my thought for the premium content. Please let me know what you guys think, because at the end of the day, what you want and what will help you learn best is really what matters. Before we start, check the video description and click the link to Teach Excel so you can download the files for the tutorial and follow along. And make sure to subscribe and accept notifications so you can see all the new tutorials. In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to take data from this form here on this form worksheet and put it into a separate worksheet and store it there as kind of a database worksheet. Now, if you haven't been watching the Bulletproof Forms in Excel series tutorials, you should go ahead and watch that. This is a continuation of those tutorials. So we're going to use the form that we created there as our sort of base level, and we're going to go from there. So I'm not going to explain how to do any of the cool stuff that we already have here. Now, the first thing that we need to do is we need to create somewhere to put our data. So let's go down here and create another worksheet. Now remember, Excel is not actually a database. However, some people are going to call this here a database and say, I want to store data in a database. It's going to be in another worksheet tab, blah, blah, blah. This isn't actually a database, but I may use some database related terms. So first, let's just call this data. Very simple. You could call it source data. Sometimes I call it raw data if I'm making big worksheets, and we're going to hide this later on. But just call it data, and the very first thing that you want to do after you create it is to figure out how your data is going to be set up. Now, I'm going to put a header row here, and you don't need to have a header row for your data, but trust me, you should really have one. It's going to be so helpful, because if you come back to this worksheet in a month, and you may not remember what this column of numbers is compared to this column of numbers. Very easy to mess up. So we're going to create a header row, and then we need to figure out what data is going to go where. So let's go back to the Form tab. We can get all of these fields. Basically, this is what we're going to save. So let's come up with an order for saving them. Here, I decided to put the name first above the ID because it makes the form look a little bit nicer, perhaps. But when you're creating a worksheet tab like this to store raw data, you should really put your ID number, whatever is your unique value for each row, in the leftmost column. It's going to make your life so much easier. So we're going to use ID here, and we're going to put that right here. Now don't worry about formatting for this worksheet. I don't need to make sure I have a capital I and a capital D. We're not going to use the spellings of the columns to line up the data, because that causes more trouble down the road. So just type it in however you want so you know what it is later on. If you wanted to, you could even put little notes here. So unique ID for each row. Whatever is going to help you understand what it is later on. Now we have name, start date, department, sector, phone. So department, sector, phone. Okay. Now the macro that we're going to create, that I'm going to show you how to build to do this, actually relies on the fact that you have one row of data up here that acts as a header. Now it's not going to destroy the macro if you don't, but it just relies on that fact, and it's good practice to do so, so I'm going to stick with that. Now let's make sure we have all the columns. Name, ID, start date, department, sector, phone. Okay. And also, don't worry about the formatting of this data here and formatting the columns over here. This data tab is not a tab that you should be seeing. Now, let's go ahead and make this form work. So we need to use some VBA for that. Hit Alt F11 on the keyboard, go to the VBA window, and make sure to download this workbook so you can follow along and understand everything. And the first thing is that this workbook follows the previous tutorial, Bulletproof Forms in Excel 4, where I showed you how to lock down everything. So actually, if we go back to the worksheet, you'll notice if I go to the Home tab, we can't do anything on this worksheet. Everything here is locked, and this code here is as well locked. So don't worry about that, but if you didn't watch the previous tutorials, watch them. You'll understand why this happens. So here, I'm going to unlock it. The password for these tutorials is very simple, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Please never make your password that in real life. So now you can see a couple things. First of all, we do have an additional sheet, presentation data. If you watched the previous tutorials, you know about that already, and we don't need to do anything with it. But down here, we have the macro that was created for the previous tutorial with a few additions that I'll cover shortly. And here we've got the new one, the store data macro. This is all that it takes right here to take data from the form and store it on another worksheet. Can you believe that? It's as simple as that. But I'm going to explain it to you now so you can make it work for your data. Let me first zoom in. Okay, so this is our store data macro. It's what we're going to use specifically to pull data from the form. So it's completely separate from the macro that we built in the previous tutorials that have to do with validation. We're simply going to use the macro we already built to call this macro. So we're going to run it separate. Now, the first thing that we're going to do is I do like to declare variables, especially when we're working with worksheets. So this section right here, we declare the variables that we're going to use for our macro. And here we're going to reference two worksheets. We're going to reference our source sheet. So you can call this whatever you want, by the way, but just make it something that you can understand. So source sheet is the sheet where our data will come from. In this case, it's going to be our form worksheet. Data worksheet, just the worksheet where we're going to store the data. Now you may also notice that I have decided to start naming the variables a little different here. So there are a couple different ways you can name variables. A lot of people will name variables here like this, where you use an underscore between them. That's fine. You can do it however you want in your own code. Just make sure that you stay consistent. So here, the technique is that for every new word in the variable, you capitalize that letter so it's a little bit easier to read. Okay, so we have this declared as a worksheet, this declared as a worksheet. I also decided to declare next row as an integer. Do I need to do that? No, not necessary. It doesn't even help with the code really in this example, so I'm not going to get any better code suggestions because I did that. Just felt like doing that. So here, if you recall from previous tutorials, how do we make this variable here basically become the worksheet? And what that means is that when we reference the worksheet for the form, we no longer have to type all of this jazz to reference that form. All we have to do, type this. And the beauty of this is that if we have to change the worksheet later on, the name of it, we don't have to change it down here, all these different places. Source sheet, source sheet, source sheet, blah, blah, blah. You only have to change it once. So that's why we do this. Quick refresher. Now, the first thing that we want to do, once we've declared our source sheet and our data sheet, is we need to get the next empty row. This is a common theme. It can seem kind of annoying. Here we go. This is the variable that's going to store the next row. And let me walk you through how you do it now. Go a little bit to the right. Oops. So first of all, where do we want to find the last row or the next empty row? We want to find it on our data sheet. So we reference our data sheet, and I'll just type this next to it so you can see how it'll look when you type your actual code. Data sheet, the second I hit a period, it'll show me all the things I can do here. Next thing is range, and you'll see down here that this is very important. For the range, I put column A. Now, the column that you put for this needs to be the column that will always be present for every row in your data set. So maybe department or sector or phone number won't always be there. Maybe even start date or name. But one thing that every record should have is an ID, a unique ID for each row. Good practice, as I said, to put that in column A. So that's why we use column A right there, because we're going to end up using this column to find the next empty row. But if we use a column that doesn't have data in it, it's not going to find the next empty row. It's going to find the next row that doesn't have data for this column, and it's going to kind of mess it up. So let's go back here. So column A, our unique ID for each row. Then which row do we want to start at? Well, it's kind of funky. This is how this works to get the last row, is you type the name of the worksheet where you want to do this. In this case, it doesn't actually matter. You don't need data sheet here. We could delete it like that, but I'll leave it in. And then rows.count. The reason that we do that is because you just want to find the last row in Excel, and if you're using a previous version in Excel, it'll be around 65,000 instead of over 1,000,000. So basically, we're telling this, go to the data sheet, go to the last row in column A, then we want to go up, so that's going to find the last row with data in it, but that's not what we want. We want to offset it by 1, so we want to go down 1, which gives us the next empty row. Now what do we want to return? We want to return the row number, so that's what .row equals. Offset, if that's a little confusing, just backspace for the open parentheses, type it in, and you'll see that row offset is the first argument and column offset is the second argument. So if we just put a 1 in here, it just says go down 1 row. All right, I know that can seem kind of confusing. I hope you don't feel like I wasted too much of your time covering that. But what I end up doing to find the next empty row, I almost never type this line out. I copy paste it. Now, all we have to do is to get the data from our form over here into our data worksheet. So we just pluck the name out, put the name there, pluck the ID out, put the ID there. That's all, because we know what the next empty row is. So here to do that, very simple. Where do we want the data? We want it on the data sheet. Where do we want it on the data sheet? We're going to use .cells here instead of range. That allows us to input numbers for the row and column reference. So where do we want to put it? What's the row? Well, we can use our next row value that we just got right up here. That's the next empty row. Okay. Now what column do we want it in? Well, this is for, we're going to do this one for name. So I'm going to follow the order of the form for my entries here. So the name should go into column 2 because column B is column 2. This isn't the second column of our table. If I had the data moved over like this column would be column 3. It's the number of the column in the worksheet. So A is column 1, B is column 2, and so on. So it goes into column 2. What are we going to do? Now that we have a reference to that cell, we're going to change the value of that cell. What are we going to put as the value of that cell? Well, we're going to set it equal to what is on our source sheet in range F6. What are we going to do with range F6? We're going to get the value out of it. So it's saying that we're going to put the value of range F6 from our source sheet into the value or into the cell in our data sheet on the next empty row in column 2. And once you have that, it's just copy and paste, going all the way down for every value that you want to copy from your form to your data worksheet. So you can see here, this goes into column 1, and we get the value from F4. That actually brings up a good point. If we go back to the form worksheet, everything here is pretty much protected and hidden and made to look nice for the form. So let's get our cell references so we can see them. We want to go to View, zoom out a little bit, make sure that formula bar is visible. So View tab, formula bar, and when you click the cell, you can see the range reference right here in the name box. So this is F4, F6, F8, and so on. So that's how we can get the cell reference from the form that we created and protected and everything else. We don't have to unprotect this worksheet to get those references. If you wanted, you could also add back the headlines, headings, and the grid lines. But once you have the formula bar, you can figure that out. Alt F11. So once you get it working for one entry, I'd say use the ID row first, since this is the one that's going to control what the next row is. Make sure that that works perfectly in your example, and then copy and paste and do it for every other element in the form. Now in the Premium Helper tutorials, I'll show you how to change this from a cell reference to a name that's easy to understand, such as ID, name, sector, department, and so on. So you don't have to remember these abstract range references. Now our macro to store or copy the data to our data worksheet is complete. So what we have to do is we have to make sure, we have to call it somehow. We have to make it run. So we go back over here to the macro that we previously created, and we go down here, no error, all is good. This means that our form passed the validation. I'm not going to cover this form, by the way, or explain it, so make sure you watch the previous tutorials if you're a little bit confused. But what I added is this bit right here. So before this tutorial, we just had a message box and resetting the show error value. Here, all you do to call the other macro is type call, and then the name of the macro, store data. The name of the macro comes from right up here after sub before the parentheses. So just, where are we? There we go. Just in the macro, wherever you want to call it, go ahead and put call store data, and it's going to run that macro. And that's pretty much all there is to connecting these two macros. Now let's go to the workbook and see if it works. Okay, we'll leave in the record for Thanos. Go to the data tab. Everything is empty, clear, nice. Let's hit submit and see what happens. Success, but was it a success? Let's find out. Bam! How cool is that? Just a few lines of code. And like I said, don't worry about the formatting over here. This over here is a format. If you expand it, you'll see the number right here. And we can go and add another record. Let's say 222. Judge Dredd started working in, I don't know, 2201. I think that's going to break validation. Nope. In Department Orange, Sector A1, sure. What's his phone number? Who are you going to call? Ghostbusters. Oops, okay, I broke the validation there. Very annoying, okay. 23. Does that work? Yes. Okay, hit submit. Success. How cool is that? Now you just created a little mini database within Excel. And you'll notice that even though we have the form tab protected, it still works, and it still unprotects it when it needs to, and then reprotects it when it's done. So everything is nice and neat. The data tab itself is currently not protected, and I'm not going to show you how to do that because I showed you how to do that in the previous tutorial. So you can either watch the previous tutorials or you can watch the premium tutorial that'll specifically show you how to do this for the data tab in addition to the form tab, which just means protect it so no one can select the data or delete it or add anything to it unless they go through the form. But like I said, I showed you how to do that feature in previous tutorials, so you can wade through those to get it, or just go to the premium one. Now this is just the start of making the form actually work. There are plenty of additional things that I have yet to show you, but one thing I want to leave you with is once you submit the data, you might want to clear it. So if I hit submit again, it's going to enter a repeat record. And there's a lot of different ways that you can avoid repeat records. I'll show you how to do those, some of those different ways in some of the premium tutorials. But right now, one of the simplest things that you can do is just to clear the data. So if we hit Alt F11, let's go over here. And all that we need to do now, I'll just type a little note, clear data, is reference the correct cell. Let's paste that down here and set it equal to nothing. Just very simple. Now I'll quickly do that for the rest of the entries. So just a lot of copy paste here. Alt F11, go back, hit submit, success, and our form is cleared. This way, if I try to, let's hit submit again, it's still going to run, or it's going to fail validation. But the point is, gosh, I love that validation. The point is that if you input a bunch of blanks down here, it would not cause our next row line of code to skip it and go here. So we wouldn't end up with a bunch of blanks in the data. Now for the very next tutorial, we're going to add a field up here and another button down here, and I'll show you how to search for data on our newly created data tab. And that'll pull the data into the form over here so we can see it in a nice, neat, and easy to read way. I hope you liked the tutorial. If it was helpful, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and make sure to subscribe and accept notifications so you can see all the new tutorials.